The blood was still pooling in the Newcastle clubhouse driveway when police arrived on the night of September 13, 2004. Two men lay writhing on the ground, their knees shattered by bullets. A third had been stripped of his club jacket and beaten unconscious. What happened here would set in motion a chain of events that would bring down one of Australia's most feared motorcycle clubs. But the man who would ultimately destroy the Nomads from within was lying in a hospital bed, his legs filled with lead, making a decision that would change everything. His name was Dale Campton. He was the Newcastle chapter's sergeant-at-arms. And in 18 months, he would become the police informant who brought it all crashing down. This is the story of betrayal, violence, and justice served cold. Act 1. The World of the Nomads. The foundation founded in Newcastle in 1968, the Nomads Motorcycle Club carved out their territory in Australia's criminal underworld with ruthless efficiency. Their patch, a skull wearing a winged helmet with pistons behind it, became a symbol of fear across the country. By the early 2000s, the Nomads had expanded to every state and territory in Australia. They weren't just weekend riders. Law enforcement classified them as a 1% club, meaning they operated outside the law and proud of it. The club's structure was military precise. Each chapter had a president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and sergeant-at-arms. The sergeant-at-arms was the enforcer, the man who kept order through violence when necessary. In Newcastle, that man was Dale Campton. Power players. The early 2000s marked a golden age for the Nomads' criminal empire. At the national level, Scott Orrick held the title of National President. A tattooed businessman who owned Skin Deep Tattoo in Newtown, Sydney, Orrick commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But it was in Parramatta where the real power lay. In 1997, something unprecedented happened. National President Greg Craig handed control of the Parramatta chapter to Sam Ibrahim, brother of the notorious King's Cross nightclub owner John Ibrahim. Sam Ibrahim didn't follow the traditional path. He skipped the prospect phase, the years of proving himself, the gradual climb through the ranks. He was patched straight in as president. This wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of in club culture. The Parramatta chapter under Ibrahim became a criminal powerhouse. They were involved in drug smuggling, weapons trafficking, and violent debt collection. The money flowed like water, and with it came arrogance. The Newcastle chapter. While Sydney and Parramatta counted money, the Newcastle chapter remained more traditional. They followed the old codes, respected the hierarchy, and kept their operations smaller but tighter. Dale Campton epitomized this old-school mentality. As sergeant-at-arms, he was responsible for discipline within the chapter. When someone stepped out of line, Campton delivered the message. When debts needed collecting, Campton collected them. When rivals needed intimidating, Campton did the intimidating. But by 2004, tensions were building between the chapters. The Parramatta crew, flush with money and power, looked down on their Newcastle brothers. They saw them as outdated, small-time operators clinging to traditions that no longer mattered. The Newcastle chapter felt disrespected. They had built the foundation that the newer chapters now stood on. They deserved recognition, not condescension. These simmering tensions would soon explode into violence that would destroy everything. Act 2. The Night That Changed Everything. September 12, 2004. The call came on a Sunday afternoon. There would be a meeting at the Newcastle clubhouse. National President Scott Orrick himself would be there, along with Parramatta President Sam Ibrahim and trusted member Paul Griffin. But this wasn't going to be a friendly chat between brothers. Around 40 nomads from the Parramatta chapter made the journey north to Newcastle that day. The convoy of motorcycles rumbling through the streets should have been a warning sign. You don't bring 40 men to a discussion. When they arrived at the Newcastle clubhouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Whatever was said in those first few minutes, it wasn't words of brotherhood. The explosion of violence was sudden and brutal. The shooting Dale Campton was the first to go down. Sam Ibrahim pulled out a gun and shot him in both knees. The crack of the pistol echoed through the clubhouse as Campton collapsed, blood already seeping through his jeans. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. Newcastle member Mark Christie was shot in both legs, his screams mixing with the chaos erupting around them. A third Newcastle member had his club jacket ripped from his body, the ultimate humiliation in biker culture. The jacket represented everything: membership, brotherhood, respect. To have it stripped away was worse than the beating that followed. The Parramatta crew then forced Campton to his feet, dragging him inside the clubhouse despite his shattered knees. They punched him until he collapsed again, leaving him on the concrete floor in a spreading pool of his own blood. When the attack was over, the Parramatta chapter roared away on their bikes, leaving 3 broken men behind. The aftermath, police arrived to find someone trying to wash away the blood in the driveway. The evidence was everywhere: a .22 caliber bullet on the ground, 45 shell casings scattered around, blood-soaked clothing, and crimson trails leading from the driveway through the backyard. The blood was running down the driveway and the backyard of the clubhouse, as well as pooling around the motorcycles, according to police reports. It looked like a war zone. When investigators interviewed Campton in the hospital 2 days later, he gave them nothing. He said he didn't know who did it, and he didn't want to know who did it, the prosecutor would later reveal. This was the code. No matter what happened, you didn't talk to police. You handled problems internally. You never, ever became a rat. But as Campton lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling while doctors worked to save his legs, something was changing inside him. The bullets hadn't just shattered his kneecaps. They had shattered his faith in the brotherhood that had defined his life. The wheels of revenge were already turning. But the revenge wouldn't come from inside the club. It would come from inside a police station. Act 3. The Informant Decision. 18 months of silence. For 18 months, Dale Campton kept his mouth shut. He underwent multiple surgeries to rebuild his knees. He walked with a permanent limp. Every step reminded him of that night in September. But the club didn't rally around him. There was no justice for what happened. The men who shot him continued to operate with impunity, counting their money, building their empire. The code that Campton had lived by for years suddenly felt hollow. He had bled for these colors. He had enforced the rules with his fists and his presence. And when he needed the brotherhood most, where were they? Scott Orrick was still national president, still running his tattoo shop, still giving interviews about club loyalty and brotherhood. Sam Ibrahim was still the Parramatta president, still untouchable. The silence wasn't protecting the club, it was protecting the men who had betrayed everything the club supposedly stood for. May 2006, the breaking point. In May 2006, Dale Campton made a phone call that would change Australian criminal history. He called the police, not to report a crime in progress, not to make a deal for reduced charges. He called to tell them exactly what happened that night in September 2004 and exactly who was responsible. The conversation was carefully recorded. Campton laid out the entire attack: who was there, who pulled the trigger, who gave the orders. He named Sam Ibrahim as the shooter. He identified Scott Orrick and Paul Griffin as participants. For the first time, police had an insider willing to break the wall of silence that surrounded the Nomads. But Campton wasn't just any insider. He was the sergeant at arms, a man who had been in the room when decisions were made. The intelligence he provided was devastating. Operations, relationships, criminal activities that police had only suspected were now confirmed by someone who had lived inside the organization. The risk: 19 on total, 20 on cause. Becoming a police informant against a motorcycle club wasn't just dangerous, it was often a death sentence. These organizations had long memories and longer reach. They had members in every state, connections to other clubs, and a code that demanded blood for betrayal. Campton knew this. He knew that if his cooperation was discovered, he wouldn't just be kicked out of the club, he would be marked for death. But he also knew something else. The system was broken. The violence wasn't protecting anything meaningful anymore. It was just feeding the egos and bank accounts of men who had forgotten what the brotherhood was supposed to mean. His decision wasn't just about revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it. It was about justice for a system that had lost its way. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Act 4. The investigation unfolds. December 2006. The arrests. 7 months after Campton first spoke to police, the hammer came down. In December 2006, simultaneous raids across Sydney netted the 3 main targets: Sam Ibrahim, Scott Orrick, and Paul Griffin. The arrest of Sam Ibrahim was particularly dramatic. Police raided his Parramatta unit, uncovering an arsenal that read like a preparation for war: weapons, ammunition, a bulletproof vest, a walking stick sword, and nunchucks. Ibrahim was charged not just with the shootings, but with 11 additional weapons and property offenses. The man who had skipped the prospect phase and walked straight into power was finally facing consequences. Scott Oruck, the national president who preached loyalty and brotherhood, was led away in handcuffs. Paul Griffin, the trusted member who had witnessed the violence, would now face justice for his role. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Australian criminal underworld. If the police could get to the top of the Nomads, no one was safe. The evidence mounts Campton's testimony wasn't the only evidence. Police had crime scene photos showing the blood trails and bullet casings. They had hospital records documenting the extent of the injuries. They had witness statements from other club members who had been present. But most importantly, they had Campton's inside knowledge of how the club operated, who made decisions, and why the attack had happened. The prosecution case was building into an avalanche that would crush the defendants. Everything they had tried to hide behind the wall of silence was being exposed in painful detail. The Nomads' greatest strength, their code of silence, had become their greatest weakness, because when someone inside finally decided to talk, they knew everything. Legal maneuvering. The defense teams knew they were in trouble. Their clients were facing serious charges based on the testimony of a man who had been inside their organization for years. They would try every legal trick in the book, challenging the credibility of the informant, questioning the validity of the evidence, arguing that Campton was motivated by revenge rather than justice. But they couldn't change the fundamental facts. 3 men had been shot, and Campton could identify who pulled the trigger. The trial would become a test of whether Australia's justice system could penetrate the wall of silence that protected criminal organizations. Act 5. The trial and its consequences. 2008. The courtroom drama. The trial began in 2008, nearly 4 years after the shooting. Dale Campton took the witness stand and, for the first time publicly, told his story. He described the attack in devastating detail: the sudden violence, the sound of gunshots, the blood on the clubhouse floor. He identified Sam Ibrahim as the man who shot him. But the trial took an unexpected turn. Someone in the gallery was secretly filming Campton as he testified. A man named Te Rana Rakete was arrested for contempt of court after he was caught recording the key witness. The filming was clearly intended to intimidate Campton and potentially identify him to club members who might want revenge. It showed that even in the supposedly safe environment of a courtroom, informants remained targets. October 2008, the verdict. In October 2008, the verdict was delivered. Not guilty on all charges. Sam Ibrahim, Scott Oruck, and Paul Griffin walked free. Despite Campton's testimony, despite the physical evidence, despite the police investigation, the jury found reasonable doubt. The acquittals sent a message that penetrating motorcycle club culture remained incredibly difficult. The wall of silence might have been breached, but it hadn't been broken. For Dale Campton, the verdict was devastating. He had risked everything to seek justice, and the system had failed him. The broader impact. But Campton's cooperation had consequences beyond this single trial. The intelligence he provided helped police understand the structure and operations of the Nomads in unprecedented detail. His decision to speak opened the door for other investigations. Other informants saw that it was possible to break free from the code of silence, even if justice wasn't always guaranteed. The Parramatta chapter was shut down in 2006 after the arrests. Many former members, including Alan Sarkis and Paulie Unan, went on to form a new organization called Notorious. The traditional nomad structure was fracturing. The old codes were being questioned. The foundation of fear and silence that had protected the organization for decades was developing cracks. Act 6. The Ripple Effects Operation, Raptor and Beyond. Dale Campton's decision to become an informant was part of a larger shift in how Australian law enforcement approached organized crime. His cooperation provided a template for penetrating these closed organizations. The formation of Strikeforce Raptor in 2009 represented a new approach to motorcycle club enforcement. Between 2015 and 2018, this specialized unit arrested over 7,500 club members, nominees, and associates, laying over 18,000 charges. The Nomads continued to face police pressure. In 2015, Major raids across New South Wales and Adelaide resulted in arrests of 12 people associated with the club, including high-ranking members. Charges included soliciting murder, kidnapping, blackmail, and assault. The Wetherill Park clubhouse was shut down as part of these operations. The organization that had once dominated criminal activity across Australia was being systematically dismantled. The price of breaking the code. Dale Campton paid a heavy price for his decision to cooperate with police. He lived with the constant threat of retaliation, the knowledge that former brothers now considered him the ultimate traitor. But his actions proved that the wall of silence could be broken, that even the most feared criminal organizations were vulnerable when their own members decided that justice mattered more than loyalty to a corrupt system. The man who had once enforced the code with violence had ultimately destroyed it with words. In choosing truth over loyalty, Dale Campton had shown that even the darkest organizations contained the seeds of their own destruction. His story became a warning to every criminal club in Australia. No organization is stronger than the conscience of its members. And when that conscience finally speaks, even the most powerful brotherhood can fall. The informant who brought down the Nomads proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy comes from within.